I still remember the sound of laughter before the silence fell. The hall smelled of metal polish and coffee, every surface gleaming too bright under the lights of the Coronado Conference Center. They called it a symposium on integrity, but everyone in the room knew it was theater. 50 officers in dress uniforms, a handful of civilians, and me, the retired NCIS agent who had once investigated the man now standing at the podium. Commander Brett Hanlon looked untouched by time, his uniform crisp, his smile fixed and rehearsed. When he noticed me, that smile twisted into something sharper. "Didn't think internal affairs gave out medals, Locke," he said, voice carrying across the room. The laughter that followed was eager, like a pack remembering who led the hunt. I could have smiled back, offered a line to smooth the edges, but I had stopped doing that years ago. "No, sir," I said evenly. "They give out clearances." And I still have one. The laughter faltered for half a breath before someone coughed, and it started again. I took my place near the front, my folder tucked under one arm, pretending the weight didn't bother me. 9 years since Ghost Return, and the word still carried a taste of salt and metal. 9 years since I signed a report that vanished into classified storage under someone else's signature. 9 years since 3 names were carved into a plaque, while the man who gave the wrong order received a promotion. When the host began the next session, Hanlon drifted closer, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "You still digging ghosts?" His tone was light, but his eyes were not. I wanted to tell him I had stopped digging long ago, that some ghosts didn't need to be found, they came back on their own. Instead, I looked straight ahead. Depends on who's still pretending they're buried. The microphone at the podium cracked, then hissed. A faint recording started to play through the overhead speakers. At first, it sounded like interference, a distortion of static and wind. Then came a voice, mine steady clipped, unmistakable. "This is Agent Avery Locke, Operation Ghost Return. Command breach confirmed." The air shifted. Chairs scraped papers, froze mid-turn. A pause followed, and then another voice, rough commanding, identical to the one now standing 3 feet away from me. "Delete that line. No one needs to know command signed it." For a second, even the air conditioning seemed to stop. Hanlon's face drained of color as the recording played those few fatal seconds. Somewhere in the back, someone whispered, "Is that real?" The file ended abruptly with a mechanical click. The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel physical. Hanlon's jaw tightened. "Where did that come from?" he asked, but his voice shook slightly. I met his eyes and spoke clearly, every word slicing the space between us. "Some ghosts never stay buried." The projector light flickered and went dark. The host stumbled forward, muttering about a technical malfunction, but nobody moved. 50 people sat frozen in their chairs, watching the space between us like it was a fault line. For a moment, the Navy's polished hierarchy cracked open, and the truth they'd buried began to breathe. I stood there, pulse steady, not triumphant, not afraid, just tired. The tape was only 30 seconds long, but it carried 9 years of silence, 3 folded flags, and one man's ambition dressed as command. I didn't know who triggered it or how it made its way into that sound system. Later, I would learn about a mirrored drive, an unsealed file, a quiet act of courage from someone still inside. But at that moment, none of it mattered. Hanlon's medals caught the light bright as they'd been that day in 2016 when the helicopter went down and he ordered the report rewritten. The same medals he'd polished before walking into this room. The same medals that now looked heavier than they ever had. No one spoke. No one laughed. Somewhere beyond the walls, the Pacific roared faintly, steady and indifferent. I looked at the rows of uniforms, the reflection of the flag trembling in the glass behind them, and realized what I had come here for was finally happening. Not revenge, not even vindication, but the first crack of silence breaking. I gathered my folder, straightened my jacket, and turned to the room that had mocked me seconds earlier. "Let's talk about integrity," I said. 6 weeks before the conference, the phone rang just after dawn. I had learned to ignore early calls since retirement. They usually came from journalists looking for a quote or from someone trying to sell me a medal I had never wanted. But this voice was different. "Avery, we need your eyes on San Diego again." It was Deputy Director Harris from NCIS Headquarters, Washington. The tone carried that mixture of respect and urgency that came only when the Bureau wanted something unpleasant handled quietly. I looked out the kitchen window. The yard in Tacoma was still half frozen, the cedar branches heavy with early March frost. The garden I had spent months tending stood in perfect order, unlike the cases I used to work. I had promised myself never to go back, never to reopen what had already been buried. "I'm retired," I said, "and I intend to stay that way." Harris hesitated. "It involves Hanlon's command unit." The sound of that name cracked something in my chest, a noise like old glass breaking. I did not ask what kind of investigation it was. I only asked when the flight left. On the table beside the phone lay the same manila folder I had refused to throw away its edges, soft with years of handling. The label read Ghost Return. It had been closed classified under Code 2049, meaning sealed for 30 years, unless authorized by Command or Congress. I opened it again for the first time in almost a decade. The first page still smelled faintly of jet fuel. Photos were clipped together with a rusted paper fastener. The images showed the aftermath of the mission, twisted wreckage snow churned by rotor wash. Faces of men who should never have been in that storm. 3 dead, 12 rescued, 1 report rewritten. I remembered the night we flew into the Bering Strait to extract the SEAL team pinned down by bad weather and worse orders. Hanlon had signed the authorization that overrode my abort call. He was supposed to be at a safe distance. He wasn't. Neither was I. The report he later submitted described the event as mechanical failure. My version, marked in red ink, said, "Command negligence." His version became the official record. Mine was buried. I stared at the note I had scrawled on the back of the final page years ago. "Integrity isn't a medal. It's a mirror." When I boarded the plane to California, the sky over Seattle was the color of steel. I traveled light one bag, and the file I swore I would never open again. The flight attendant smiled when she saw my veteran ID, asked if I wanted to pre-board. I declined. I preferred the quiet. During the flight, I tried to read the in-flight magazine, but my mind replayed that single radio transmission from years ago. Abort, repeat, abort. Silence. Then the command voice I recognized. Negative. Proceed. I had thought the storm swallowed it all, but sometimes memory has a black box of its own. When the plane began its descent, the view of San Diego spread beneath the clouds like a photograph from a different life. The ocean shimmered pale blue, deceptively calm. Coronado Island looked smaller than I remembered, a strip of order surrounded by chaos. From the window seat, I could almost see the hangar where the Ghost Return team had first taken off. Time hadn't erased the geometry of loss. It had only traced sharper lines around it. At the airport, a junior NCIS officer waited with a placard bearing my name. He couldn't have been more than 26. His uniform looked stiff, his salute uncertain. "Ma'am, Director Harris said to escort you to base housing." I nodded. He talked during the drive, the kind of polite chatter meant to fill silence. He mentioned the conference, the upcoming review of leadership ethics, the guest list packed with high-ranking SEAL officers. I kept my gaze on the water outside the window. The bridge curved over the bay, sunlight cutting off the surface like glass. When we reached the gate at Coronado, the guard scanned my credentials. "Retired?" he asked. "Consultant," I said. He smiled without understanding. Inside the base banners hung on every building, "Honor is our oxygen." The phrase made my teeth ache. I was led to a temporary office with nothing but a desk, a computer, and a single framed photo of a naval carrier. A packet sat on the table marked "Confidential." I opened it. Inside were briefing materials for the conference and a list of attendees. Hanlon's name was printed near the top, followed by his title, Commander SEAL Operations West. The margin note in someone else's handwriting read, "Potential Keynote." I sat down, folded my hands, and let the weight of the room settle. Outside, the sound of jets roared across the runway, steady as a heartbeat. For a moment, I thought about turning around, returning to Tacoma, pretending the call never came. But I knew that once you answer one ghost, the others follow. I reached for the folder again. The first page was a mission map, the coordinates written in fading blue ink. Someone had underlined the phrase, "Command Override," in red. I traced the line with my finger. I could almost hear the static of the radio, the wind against the fuselage, the silence after the engine stopped. There were moments in life that refused to end. They simply looped until someone told the truth aloud. The door opened slightly, and a voice said, "Agent Locke Director Harris wants you at the command briefing at Yo 900. I nodded without turning. When the door closed, I closed the folder and whispered to the empty room, "You can retire from the field, not from truth." Then I looked at the folder again and added quietly, "Some files don't sleep. Orders fade. Records don't." Coronado looked cleaner than I remembered, and that was never a good sign. Fresh paint, new slogans, polished brass, the kind of shine that tried too hard to hide rust. Banners lined the road from the main gate to the administrative wing, each one carrying the same phrase in blue and gold, "Honor is our oxygen." I parked near the NCIS annex, stepped out into the salt air, and smelled the faint chemical tang of disinfectant. Bases always smelled like that when someone wanted to erase history. Inside, the corridors buzzed with the rhythm of an efficient machine. Young officers moved in pairs, clipped steps, crisp salutes. Their voices lowered when I passed, not out of respect, but recognition. You could tell who had read your file by how they looked away. The clerk at the front desk glanced up his badge, reading Morales Lex A. His voice cracked slightly when he said my name. "Ma'am, you are cleared for Command Access B. I was told to escort you." He could not have been more than 25. His uniform hung a little loose the way it did on men who had not yet filled out their certainty. "Lieutenant Morales," I said, reading his name again. "Information Security." His eyes brightened. "Yes, ma'am. I actually studied your case files at Quantico. Ghost Return was legendary." I stopped walking. Was his smile faltered? They erased it last year. Digital archives, physical logs, even citation records. The system shows it as decommissioned. Officially, it never existed. The words landed like small explosions. I had known they would bury it eventually, but hearing it said aloud made the air thin. "Who authorized that?" I asked. He hesitated. It was before my time. But I saw the request header, SEAL Command West. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside and said quietly, "They polished the memorial, not the truth." He frowned, unsure if I meant it literally. Upstairs, the corridors were lined with photographs of commendations and field teams. Hanlon's face appeared in 3 of them. Same grin, same eyes that never matched the smile. His career had aged well. Mine had turned into a cautionary tale. The conference room where I was to report smelled of coffee and new carpet. A woman stood by the window tablet in hand, her posture straight but weary. Her voice came before her name. "Agent Locke. I thought they said you would never set foot here again." It took me a moment to place her. Ruth Hanlon, psychologist, his ex-wife, now assigned as base ethics evaluator. Doctor. "Hanlon," I said evenly. She smiled without warmth. "Just Ruth these days. My ex prefers titles." I heard. I placed my folder on the table, still treating soldiers who dream of ghosts. Her gaze sharpened. "He still has nightmares about July 2016. You're in them." I looked out the window toward the flight line. "Nightmares don't mean remorse." She sighed. "You both walked out of that storm alive. That should mean something." "It does," I said. "It means someone else didn't." She did not argue. She just watched me the way people do when they are cataloging a wound they cannot see. "They say this conference is about leadership," she said finally. "What it really is about is rehabilitation, image management. They want to close the last open wound before it festers." I nodded. They should have thought of that before they rewrote the autopsy. her brow furrowed. "Avery, if you are here to reopen that file, be careful. There are careers attached to those pages. There were lives attached to them first." I gathered my notes and left before she could reply. Outside the main building, the sun hit the tarmac with blinding clarity. Beyond the runway stood the Memorial Plaza. It had been renovated since I last saw it. Marble now, not stone, with embedded lights that glowed faintly even in daylight. 3 names carved into the surface: Latin Michael Hearn, Petty Officer, Daniels Chief Alvarez. Below them, the inscription read, "Duty Beyond Fear." No mention of who gave the order. I traced the carved letters with one finger, the cold surface catching the light. A line of paint at the base of the monument caught my eye. Beneath the gleaming polish, a faint gray mark bled through barely visible but there integrity breach, reclassified. Someone had painted over the original dedication instead of removing it. They had built the new words on top of the old lie. They polished the memorial. I whispered, not the truth. A soft voice answered behind me. "Ma'am, if you need the historical files, I can try to pull fragments from the backup." It was Lex Morales again. He held a small data key in his palm. "These are log entries recovered from 2017, right before the purge. I wasn't sure if you wanted them." I took the key. "What made you think I did?" "Because you came back," he said simply. I pocketed it. "Keep this between us." He nodded. "Every base has its own ghosts," I said. "Some wear stars." He hesitated. "Ma'am, if you reopen this, they will notice. Command doesn't like the past echoing. Then they should have stayed silent." I turned toward the administration wing. The afternoon sun threw long shadows across the courtyard. I walked slowly, counting the flagpoles, the hum of the generators, the low thunder of aircraft overhead. Every detail looked immaculate, disciplined, deliberate. And yet beneath the order, I could feel it, the pulse of a secret still alive. Back in my quarters, I slid the data key into the terminal. The screen flickered, then filled with a string of partial files. Most were corrupted. One fragment displayed a timestamp 07-14-2016-2304Z. The metadata tag read, "Operation GR7, audio file missing, transcript unavailable." A single text note appeared at the bottom, "Override executed by CDR Hanlon." My throat tightened. I closed the screen, leaned back, and listened to the distant rumble of jets taking off into the night. Outside, the Pacific wind rattled the blinds like a whisper through metal. Somewhere in the distance, music played faintly from the officers' club laughter carried by the breeze. I sat there a long time, staring at the line on the monitor until the words blurred. They had tried to erase the evidence, but ghosts have a way of rewriting themselves into every system. Before I shut the computer down, I typed one sentence into my notes file: "Every lie has coordinates." I pressed save and turned off the light. The base slept around me, efficient and unaware, breathing in its own perfection. But I could feel it now, the crack under the surface, the same one that had followed me for 9 years. Some truths survive deletion. Some memories never stand down. The training hall smelled of coffee and waxed floors. Rows of officers sat in formation, their notebooks identical, their expressions eager in the way subordinates always are when command watches. Commander Brett Hanlon stood at the front, sleeves rolled up just enough to look casual, the shine on his medals catching the overhead light. I had been asked to observe the session on operational integrity, to offer insight from my years in internal investigations. Instead, I became the lesson. "Tell us," Locke Hanlon said, turning toward me with that easy smile. "How many enemies did paperwork kill?" Laughter filled the room, polite at first, then louder as others followed the tone he set. I did not look up. I wrote one sentence in my notebook and underlined it twice. "Ego is a louder weapon than guns." The laughter echoed against the walls, then faded. Hanlon continued his lecture as though nothing had happened. I listened in silence, watching him perform leadership like a script he had memorized too well. When the session ended, officers filed out in groups. I gathered my notes slowly, letting the noise drain away. A shadow appeared beside me. It was Lex Morales clutching a small data tablet to his chest. His voice trembled slightly. "Ma'am, I found something." I looked at him. "You should not be here. I know, but you need to see this." He placed the tablet on the table and opened a secure folder. The screen displayed a list of archived files with most marked as deleted. One blinked faintly, GR7, the same code name as Ghost Return. It was buried in a mirror system, he whispered. A backup no one touched since the reclassification. I studied the screen. The metadata showed an original timestamp from July 2016. He played the file. Static filled the room, then a familiar voice broke through the interference. Mine. Agent Locke requesting mission abort weather non-viable. Another pause, then Hanlon's voice sharp, certain. Negative. Proceed, override abort, execute command. The file ended abruptly. Silence took its place. Lex looked at me, eyes wide. It's authentic. The checksum matches. They never deleted it from the secondary system. I closed the tablet. "Don't leak it," I said. He looked confused. "But this is proof. Proof is worthless if no one listens. Let him hang himself publicly." His mouth opened as though to argue, then closed again. "Yes, ma'am." I handed the tablet back. "Delete the trace of your access. And Lex, you never brought this to me." He nodded, swallowing hard. I left the hall and walked out into the late afternoon light. The air smelled of jet fuel and ocean salt. Planes roared overhead, their shadows gliding across the ground like dark birds. I watched one disappear into the clouds and felt the same mix of dread and inevitability that had followed me since the call from Washington. That night, I returned to my quarters. The base was quiet except for the low hum of the generators and the distant rhythm of waves. I sat at the desk, the folder open beside me. Every page inside had been handled by men who believed silence equaled control. I wondered if Hanlon ever thought about the moment he chose to override me, or if the sound of his own command voice had become its own justification. At 2300, I heard a faint click from the intercom speaker above the door, followed by static. My heart tightened. The system was automated, triggered only for announcements or alarms. Then the static cleared, and the same recording from earlier began to play. My voice, his command, the exact 30-second fragment Lex had shown me. Negative. Proceed. Override abort. The words filled the quarters, then spilled into the hallway. I opened the door. Across the corridor, lights flickered on. Doors opened. Faces emerged, confused. The recording repeated once more before cutting to silence. Somewhere across the base, alarms blinked red for a system breach. I walked toward the command building. The night air had turned sharp, the kind of cold that made metal ring. When I reached the control room, officers stood frozen listening. Hanlon was there, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. The same voice that had mocked me hours earlier now came out as a whisper. That file was destroyed. I met his eyes. So were lives. For a long moment, no one spoke. The hum of the electronics filled the gap between us. He looked at the officers gathered around him, searching for words, but the authority in his voice had vanished. "This is a malfunction," he said finally, but even he sounded unconvinced. One of the technicians glanced at me, then at Hanlon. "Sir, the system indicates manual scheduling. Playback initiated by timer at 2300. No external trigger." Hanlon's jaw tightened. He turned to me, anger flickering behind his eyes. "You did this." "I did not have to," I said. The system spoke louder than I did. He stepped closer, voice low. "You think this will destroy me?" "No," I said quietly. "I think you already did." I turned and walked out before he could answer. Outside, the base had gone still. The American flag hung motionless in the faint wind. Somewhere, a dog barked, then stopped. I passed a group of young officers, whispering, their faces pale in the security lights. One of them muttered my name the way you do when a story turns real. Back in my quarters, I found the notebook still open on the desk. I added one more line beneath my earlier note, "Ghosts don't need witnesses, only playback." Then I closed it and stared at the ceiling until the lights of the base dimmed for curfew. In the silence that followed, I could hear the ocean again, steady and endless, washing against the walls like an old memory coming back to life. The morning after the recording, a colder light slid across the base. An email waited for me before sunrise with a subject that did not pretend to be polite: suspension of access pending inquiry. The notice came from Commander Brett Hanlon and linked a suspected data breach to my quarters. It ordered me to surrender my badge and my terminal within the hour. I read it twice, then watched the flags pull hard against a wind that smelled like rain. I turned in the badge at 7. The clerk did not meet my eyes, as if a look could spread whatever I carried. Without the card, my footsteps sounded louder. Doors that once opened with a soft chime stayed shut and indifferent. A captain from the training hall cleared his throat as I passed and hurried the other way. I kept moving. Dignity is the quiet answer to staged humiliation. Inside the administrative wing, a junior investigator read questions in a room the size of a storage closet. He asked whether I had scheduled a playback, whether I had touched auxiliary systems, whether I had spoken with any officer about sealed records. I answered like a deposition. Not with any device in my possession, not to my knowledge, not without proper authority. He wrote each reply in patient block letters and avoided my gaze. When we finished, he slid a receipt across the table for my badge and thanked me with the tone reserved for weather updates. Outside the interview room, the corridor hummed with fluorescent calm. I walked into the courtyard and found Lieutenant Lex Morales waiting near the memorial steps, a small duffel at his feet, and resolve on his face. He handed me a drive wrapped in an inspection cloth. "Mirror copy," he whispered. "The purge missed the secondary backup. Command messages and maintenance logs from July are on it." I closed my fingers around the cloth and felt the weight of a choice. "You should not have risked this," I said. He shook his head. "I already did when I told myself to forget it. People died. I owe them." "Keep it hidden," I said. "If they trace this, you never saw me." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and the words sounded like a promise he had already made to himself. As I crossed the lot, I saw Ruth Hanlon moving toward the same doorway with a file pressed tight to her chest. She stopped beside me and looked at the empty space on my lapel. "How long will you keep punishing her for your guilt?" she asked, and her voice did not rise. The question traveled past me to the man behind her. Hanlon stepped into the light with that careful neutrality on his face, and then restraint snapped. "You were not there," he said. "You did not hear the screaming." The courtyard held that echo a breath longer than comfort allowed. Ruth did not flinch. "I heard you for 9 years, she answered. He looked away first. Power shifted an inch, and everyone nearby felt it without knowing why. I left them and drove off base to a diner by the marina, the same place where I used to meet Agent Marcus Delaney when a case ran longer than reason. He was already at a corner table, jacket folded, eyes steady. We did not shake hands. We did not talk about the night before. We ordered coffee and let the clatter of cups cover the sound of the past waking up. Marcus set an older recorder on the table, the kind with weight and patience. I never trusted the new ones, he said. This came off the downlink that night before the signals went to central storage. He pressed play. Weather hissed through the small speaker. Then my voice came clear, stripped, and steady. Agent Locke requesting abort conditions non-viable, a beat of radio wind. Hanlon answered with the confidence of someone who believed consequence was a theory. Negative. Proceed. Override abort. Execute command. Another beat, and in the background the sound I had tried not to hear in dreams, the sound of a rotor fighting cold and time. Marcus stopped the tape and let the air refill the space between us. You think exposure heals, he said. It just shifts scars. I watched the steam rise from my coffee and disappear. Then I will move the scar where everyone can see it. He studied my face. They will call this personal. They will say an old grudge is wearing a fresh uniform. Let them say it, I said. A clean lie is still a lie. He nodded. I made a duplicate years ago, he said. The master is yours if you want it. Keep the copy, I said. If they ask you lost a relic and kept your word. He slid the recorder back across the table, and the weight of it felt like a quiet verdict. Outside, the bay wore the color of cold metal. My phone vibrated with a restricted number. The voice on the line was familiar in the way a blade is familiar. "Stop while you can," it said. "This is not a threat. It is a courtesy." I let the silence hold for a count of 3. Courtesy would have been leaving the record intact the first time. The line clicked off. I drove the longer road back to the base past beaches where recruits ran in tight pairs, past docks where ships wore their patterns of rust and pride. By evening, the inquiry notice had become a bulletin, pinned outside the mess. Pending investigation of unauthorized access to command systems, Agent Avery Locke is suspended from all consultancy duties. Members are reminded that discussion of sensitive matters is prohibited. Someone had penciled 3 small words under the print, faint but deliberate. "Let it play." I folded the page and slipped it into my folder, not as proof, but as a measure of temperature in the ranks. Back in my quarters, the room felt smaller without the badge in my pocket. I placed the mirror drive on the desk and connected it to a private device that had never touched the base network. Directory lists filled the screen, message threads, inventory tables, security notes, and a rehearsal plan for the conference. One thread mentioned a contingency for audio playback during the keynote and listed an operator code that did not belong to public affairs. Another showed a sequence of maintenance tickets for the hall sound system, each one closed within minutes of opening, as if someone were testing a door and slamming it shut again. I drafted a statement in case the inquiry hardened into a hearing. Times, names, the chain of authorization that touched ghost return. I kept the language spare because evidence does its best work without adjectives. When the draft was done, I sent a single sentence through a secure channel that still recognized my clearance. I can produce material evidence of command override related to the incident known as ghost return. Then I shut the device and listened to the base settle around me. Night arrived like a tide that had memorized the shoreline. From the officers' club, a piano sent careful notes into the dark. In that soft music, I could hear the story Hanlon would prefer. Technical anomaly, bitter former agent, misunderstanding resolved. I thought of Ruth and the practiced mercy in her voice. I thought of Lex with the drive warm in his palm. I thought of the 3 names on the memorial and the paint hidden under the polish. When the room became too small, I stepped into the wind and walked the perimeter road. Security lights threw long bars across the pavement. The ocean breathed beyond the fence, with the patience of something that has seen every rank rise and fall. On the way back, I passed a window and saw my reflection layered over the glow of the operations floor. Once my badge had opened those doors. Tonight it opened nothing, and yet the truth followed without asking. Power had shifted another inch. Tomorrow it would shift again. He built his legacy on silence. I had given it sound. Truth does not flinch under command. It waits, and when someone finally speaks, it stands up. The auditorium for leadership under fire looked staged for certainty. Flags framed the dais, brass rails shone, and the screen behind the lectern waited like a sealed confession. My badge was suspended, yet the program still called me an honored guest. Hanlon managed the show with the easy authority of a man accustomed to the last word. He welcomed donors, nodded to reporters, and spoke about duty as if it were a medal you could polish until it erased memory. When he introduced me, he smiled in a way the cameras liked. He said my name and my years, and the topics I had been invited to address: integrity, accountability, lessons learned. The crowd gave the applause you give when you are sure how the next hour ends. I walked to the center and let the room settle. I kept to the theme at first. Leadership under fire is not about volume. It is about pressure and proof. Procedures protect the living and honor the fallen. Internal review is not a weapon. It is a compass. I let those sentences settle, then glanced toward the wings. A technician lifted a thumb to confirm the final slide. I returned the gesture and pressed the remote once to advance to the closing image. The screen stayed black. For a breath, the room assumed this was theater. Then wind hissed from the speakers, the way weather does when a door opens to a night you should have respected. My voice came first, calm and clipped. Agent Avery Locke requesting mission abort. Conditions non-viable. Static followed, and then a second voice entered with the steadiness of habit. Negative. Proceed. Override abort. Execute command. The recording ended. For a long moment, nothing moved. The cameras paused. The pens stopped. The bodies that had swayed with ritual went still. Proof does that. It turns choreography into stone. Hanlon did not interrupt. His jaw worked, then relaxed, then hardened again. He took a single step toward the lectern and stopped when the file replayed at full volume, the consonants sharp as metal. When it ended a second time, I spoke. Integrity is not lost in storms. It is lost in comfort. Weather can be cruel, but weather does not sign orders. We bury outcomes in language until no one can find the author. Leadership without accountability empties words like honor of air. Breathe the truth. You will not suffocate. You will need it. From the panel row behind me, Ruth stood and walked to the edge of the stage. She looked at Hanlon as if she could finally see the shape of the choice he had made. How long will you command graves? The sentence crossed the room and came to rest where denial had been living. He drew in a breath as if to answer, and found no words fit the space. A maintenance log appeared on the screen, a series of entries closing within minutes on the auditorium sound system. The last line tagged a test at 22:59. In the lower corner, a technician had noted playback verified. The hall took that small fact the way a body takes air after too long underwater. The moderator whispered into a mic that was no longer the center of attention. Reporters watched without speaking. The senior officers in the first two rows stared at the screen, then at Hanlon, then at me, and then at their own hands as if the truth might be written there. No one cheered, no one heckled. The hall simply absorbed the weight. Silence can be many things. Today, it was recognition. I described the path the file had taken. A secondary archive had preserved what the purge missed. A mirrored drive had kept the checksum intact. Independent custodians had secured duplicates under lawful authority. The chain was clean. The record was not a rumor. It was a voice. The hall listened the way people do when they realize a story they liked is not the story they are in. Hanlon tried again. This is context stripped for effect. A technician spoke from the aisle without leaving his post. Sir, the recording predates the after-action draft. Metadata confirms it. Another officer said quietly that the memorial inscription had been painted over, not replaced. Details matter when truth returns. The room did not turn into a tribunal. It did not need to. It had already seen what it came to see. I closed my folder but left my hands on the lectern. I said that accountability is a practice, not a ceremony that rank multiplies responsibility that the dead deserve, sentences that do not lie for our comfort. I asked the room to remember that honor is our oxygen only if the mask is open. Then I stopped. No flourish, no accusation, only a full stop where the habit of euphemism usually adds a cushion. The applause did not rush the way relief does after a routine keynote. It arrived late and careful, a series of single claps that found one another as people decided what to believe. The applause came slower than the guilt. It gathered until it became steady enough to be called support. I felt none of the triumph people imagine in moments like this. Satisfaction is not the measure. Breathing is. For once, the speakers did not lie. They carried a sound the base had refused for 9 years. Hanlon left the stage by the side stairs and sat in a chair near the exit. Security did not escort him. He did not leave. He stared at the floor as if trying to find the line he had rehearsed and misplaced. A junior lieutenant stepped in front of him and saluted. The gesture meant respect for the uniform and refusal of the act. Ruth joined me at the foot of the stage. We stood without touching two people who had traveled different roads to the same door. She said that the truth had landed. I answered that landing is only the first safe moment. The next is what you do when the engines stop. Outside the glass wall, the bay threw back a hard shine. Flags along the promenade snapped in the wind. Officers lingered in the aisles, speaking quietly, some with their heads bowed as if in a chapel. A reporter asked whether this was about revenge. I said no. This was about record. Ghost Return was never about death. It was about command. The difference matters because names matter. He wrote a single word in his notebook and did not ask another question. When the hall finally began to empty, I stood alone at the lectern and looked at the screen one last time. The black rectangle reflected the room like still water. I thought about the 3 names on the stone outside and the paint hidden under the polish. I thought about the young officers who would teach others what this day meant. I thought about the quiet that followed the recording and how it felt like a promise rather than a threat. Then I left the stage and walked into the light with nothing to carry but the certainty that proof had finally entered the room and found a place to stand. Behind me, the hall exhaled like a ship releasing lines, slow and certain, and the bay answered with wind. Justice did not shout. It stood up, and the room finally stood with it at last. The headlines came before dawn. Retired NCIS agent leaks classified data. The phrasing was deliberate, heavy enough to shift sympathy without touching proof. My phone vibrated until the battery died. Every outlet from D.C. to San Diego ran the same footage of me at the conference frozen mid-sentence beneath the words, "Integrity isn't lost in storms." They edited out the applause. The Department of Defense released a 2-sentence statement by noon. A review committee has been convened. The department maintains confidence in ongoing leadership. In translation, it meant they would study the optics before deciding whom to burn. By afternoon, my access had been fully revoked. My name disappeared from consultant rosters, from door logs, from mailing lists. It was as if I had never existed, except as controversy. Lex Morales called once from a restricted line. His voice came through thin and careful. They reassigned me to Hawaii, communications security rotation. He paused, then added, "I'm sorry, ma'am. I told him not to be. Distance is safety. Remember that." He said yes, ma'am, and hung up the way people do when loyalty feels heavier than rank. Ruth sent a message through an old encrypted address. It contained no greeting, only a single sentence. "I resigned this morning. The cost is overdue." I read it twice and did not reply. That night, I packed what remained of my uniforms and left Coronado before sunrise. Tacoma was gray and wet when I arrived. The air smelled of cedar and salt. My cabin sat where it always had, at the edge of the inlet, where fog drifts slow enough to look like thought. Inside, the walls were lined with folders that never made it into official archives. I turned on the old radio that still crackled between stations and listened to static that sounded almost like surf. The television news mentioned my name every half hour. Analysts speculated about motive, about trauma, about the psychology of whistleblowers. A retired admiral said integrity must follow the chain of command. Another anchor said heroes are rarely tidy. I let them talk. The truth no longer needed my defense. It had its own circulation. On the second day, an unmarked envelope arrived without return address. Inside was a clipping from the Washington Post. Former NCIS agent exposes cover-up. Command silent. The article listed dates, operations, casualties, and one short paragraph confirming that the Department of the Navy had opened a formal ethics inquiry into Commander Brett Hanlon's conduct. They called it a preliminary review. I called it gravity. The phone rang again. This time it was Marcus Delaney. "You know this won't stop," he said. "They will question every file you ever touched. That's what they do when they run out of arguments." I said, "Let them." He sighed. "You lost your badge." "Maybe, but not my soul." There was a long pause. Then he said quietly, "Some metals rust in sunlight." He hung up before I could answer. In the following weeks, reporters appeared near the dock hoping for a statement. I never gave one. The neighbors grew protective, turning away cars that lingered too long. Mail came without names. Some envelopes held thanks, others blame. One held 3 pressed poppies from an anonymous sender. I kept them on the windowsill. The tide moved in and out as it always had, carrying the same rhythm as the years I had spent chasing truth across continents. The difference was silence. Silence had texture now. It no longer felt like isolation. It felt like ownership. The inquiry stretched on. Weeks turned to months. Each update carried less outrage, more bureaucracy. A classified memo leaked saying the tape was authentic. Another leak revealed Hanlon's resignation before findings were published. His retirement ceremony was canceled quietly. There were no statements, no interviews, only a single photo of him boarding a flight to Virginia with no medals on his coat. I saw it once online and closed the browser. "Justice has waves too," I said aloud to the empty room. The radio hummed low, catching fragments of maritime reports, small craft warning in effect, winds increasing after midnight. I smiled at the precision. The sea respects clarity more than comfort. That evening, I walked to the shore. The water was dark and restless, the kind that carries old secrets in its pull. I watched it rise against the rocks until spray touched my face. Behind me, the cabin window glowed faintly, a single square of yellow against the gray. For the first time in months, my breathing matched the tide. I realized justice is not a single act or verdict. It is motion. It comes in intervals and swells, sometimes years apart. You can lose everything you carry and still keep what you are. The badge, the title, the base, the clearance they were weather. The compass remains. Somewhere in the distance, a ship sounded its horn long and even neither farewell nor greeting. I turned back toward the path and felt the ground steady beneath my boots. Tomorrow the noise would start again, another headline, another interpretation. But tonight the truth was quiet and complete. I had done what the living owe the dead I had spoken. Would you risk your retirement to reveal the truth? Tell me below. He came without warning on the first Sunday of September, when the air in Tacoma felt tired and clean after a night of rain. I saw him through the window. Before the knock came Brett Hanlon in plain clothes that fit like an apology. No uniform, no ribbons, no mask of command. Just a man reduced to what he could still stand upright in. His hair had turned gray around the temples, the kind that comes not from age, but from knowing the exact weight of one's own decisions. When he knocked, it was soft, as if he feared the sound might break. I opened the door without saying his name. He looked older, smaller, the kind of smallness that follows guilt, not time. He said my name like a question. Avery. I let the silence hold long enough for him to feel it. Then I stepped aside. The cabin smelled of cedar and coffee. He looked around as if expecting medals hanging from the beams or a file on the table waiting for him. Nothing here was staged. He sat across from me at the small kitchen table and folded his hands together. I've lost everything, he said. My badge, my pension, my reputation. They took the house in Coronado. Ruth won't speak to me. Morales won't return my calls. I said nothing. He leaned forward the way people do when they think distance equals forgiveness. I kept the one thing I shouldn't have, he said finally. Denial. The word sat between us like a verdict. For a moment he looked almost relieved to have said it aloud. I answered quietly. You kept the one thing that ruined you. He flinched but didn't turn away. My son asked me last week, he said. Were you the hero or the reason? He wanted to know what that meant. I couldn't answer him. I waited. Sometimes the longest silence is the only truth left. He rubbed his palms together. I need your help, Avery. They're moving forward with charges under Article 92, dereliction of duty. The lawyer says, if I can show mitigating circumstances, stress, procedural pressure, chain confusion, it might reduce the sentence. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a single envelope. Inside was a form titled, Character Reference Prior Service. He slid it across the table toward me. One letter, he said. Just one. You know I didn't mean for those men to die. You know I tried to keep it contained. My words came out even. You contained it so well it stayed buried for 9 years. He tried again. It was complicated. Everything was chaos that night. You had no idea what it was like in command. My voice stayed calm. You gave an order that killed people who trusted you. Complication doesn't erase command. He reached for his coffee cup, but his hands shook too much to lift it. I watched him set it back down, liquid trembling inside. "Please, Avery," he said. "You were there. You know the full picture. One letter could mean the difference between confinement and suspension, between disgrace and recovery." He paused. "Between my son growing up ashamed or not." I looked at him, then really looked. The lines on his face told the story better than any file. Not the story of the scandal, but of a man who had finally run out of edits. I stood, walked to the bookshelf, and took out an old NCIS badge that had long expired. Its edges were worn smooth from years of use, its number faint. I placed it on the table between us. "This clearance is expired. So is my sympathy." His lips parted as if to argue, but no sound came. His eyes fell to the badge, then back to me. "You think this helps?" he whispered. "You think truth keeps you warm at night?" I said it doesn't have to. It just has to keep you honest. He leaned back, the chair creaking under him. Outside, the rain began again, soft but insistent, tapping against the window in rhythm with his breathing. He looked toward the sound, then back at me. "They'll destroy me," he said. "No," I said. "You already did that. They're just writing it down." For a long while, neither of us spoke. The clock on the counter clicked through each second like a slow march. Finally, he stood. He left the envelope on the table and moved toward the door. When his hand touched the knob, he hesitated. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Exposing me." The word regret felt foreign in the room. I answered carefully. "I regret the silence that came before. I don't regret the sound that followed." He nodded once, a soldier accepting the inevitable. Then he opened the door and stepped into the gray. He didn't look back. 2 weeks later, the news confirmed what I already expected. Commander Brett Hanlon was formally indicted on 3 counts of falsifying operational reports and obstruction of an internal investigation. There were no photographs, no statements, only a single paragraph buried on page 8 of the Times. I clipped it and pinned it inside a folder marked "Ghost Return, Closure." That night, for the first time in years, I opened the drawer where the old recorder rested, the same one Marcus had handed me in the diner. I set it on the table and pressed play. The sound came alive again. My voice, his command, the chaos that followed. I listened all the way through, not flinching at the parts that used to pull breath from my chest. When the recording ended, I took a match from the counter and struck it against the edge of the ashtray. The flame caught easily. I held it above the recorder for a moment, watching the heat bend the air, then lowered it onto the tape. Plastic curled labels darkened. Smoke rose with the faint smell of old metal. The sound of it burning was not violent. It was steady, almost patient. I watched until it was nothing but a small glow in the center of gray ash. The radio played softly from the corner, some forgotten jazz station bleeding through static. Outside, the rain stopped, and the sea returned to its slow rhythm. For the first time since the file surfaced, I felt my heartbeat match the tide. He came for forgiveness and found evidence. I didn't need revenge. The truth already had teeth. Some men pray for peace after making war on it. I simply listened until the room grew quiet enough to believe that peace, at last, had answered. The hearing room in Washington smelled faintly of paper and cold coffee. Rows of cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking like small, patient eyes. The committee sat beneath the seal of the United States Senate, its gold lettering catching the pale morning light that filtered through tall curtained windows. I had been here before years ago, testifying on cyber forensics and procedural reform. This time, the subject was not theory, but blood. The placard in front of me read, "Avery Locke, former NCIS senior field agent." The title was accurate, but it no longer felt like a name. They called the session Integrity Oversight Hearing Operation Ghost Return. The irony did not go unnoticed. The clerk swore me in. My right hand rose automatically, though the gesture felt detached, like muscle memory borrowed from another life. Across the table, Senator Morgan, the chair, adjusted his glasses. A veteran of another war, older than the rest, his voice carried both exhaustion and respect. He nodded slightly the way soldiers do when they recognize a survivor. Then he pressed the button on the microphone. "Agent Locke, thank you for coming. The video you provided has been authenticated by the Defense Oversight Board. We will play it once for the record." The lights dimmed. The screen descended from the ceiling with a mechanical hum. The same 30 seconds that had frozen a hall in Coronado now filled this marble chamber. My voice, then his. Negative. Proceed. Override abort. Execute command. Static. End. The room absorbed it differently this time, not with shock, but with the slow gravity of confirmation. Facts always weigh more when they have nowhere left to hide. When the lights came back on, the senator leaned forward. "Why record it, Agent Locke?" The question was not accusatory. It was weary human. I looked at him then, at the row of aides taking notes, as if history could be managed by bullet points. "Because truth without proof dies in the chain of command," I said. "Paper burns, memory fades, but voices last. If you want accountability, you must leave it no exits." A quiet murmur rippled through the room. Another senator younger leaned into her microphone. "In your assessment, what allowed this to happen?" I answered carefully. Toxic leadership grows where loyalty replaces conscience. When silence becomes a condition for belonging, command turns into cover. They asked more questions about procedure, about oversight, about policy. I gave them answers that were honest but measured. I knew the difference between a statement and a soundbite. One builds record, the other fills headlines. A retired admiral seated behind the committee raised a hand for acknowledgement. With the chair's permission, he addressed me. He said, "In your years of service, have you seen this pattern before?" I said yes. It happens when institutions teach survival as virtue. The cameras panned, searching for reactions. None came. Hanlon's name entered the record next. The clerk read the disciplinary outcomes from the Department of the Navy. Effective immediately, Commander Brett Hanlon was reduced in rank, stripped of pension privileges, and ordered to undergo post-traumatic counseling at Walter Reed. His request for clemency was denied by unanimous vote. There were no objections, no applause, only pens, moving quietly across notepads. The storm finally had witnesses. Senator Morgan leaned closer again. "You could have accepted the reinstatement offered last week," he said. "Advisory clearance special counsel. Why refuse?" I let the silence stretch before answering. "Because service without conscience is maintenance, not honor. I served once. I'll leave it at that." The senator nodded. "Sometimes refusal is the only testimony left." He looked down, scribbled something in his notes, then closed the folder. The hearing continued for hours. Experts spoke, reforms were proposed, subcommittees formed. My part ended in 20 minutes, but they kept me seated as symbol. That was the point of this morning, the optics of acknowledgement. Still, I stayed. Symbols, when earned, can be weapons, too. During recess, a reporter caught me in the hallway. She asked if I considered myself a whistleblower or a patriot. I told her the truth is not patriotic or treasonous. It's oxygen. She smiled faintly, maybe because she understood, or maybe because it was the quote she needed. In the afternoon, I stood by the reflecting pool outside the Capitol. The air was crisp, the surface of the water broken only by wind. The dome reflected upside down like a truth that needed perspective to stay visible. A group of young cadets passed by, laughing, notebooks under their arms. One of them glanced at me and whispered my name. I caught his look. Curiosity, respect, maybe warning. He would carry that story somewhere else someday. That was enough. As the sun began to drop, my escort approached. The committee thanked me again. The staff would follow up with written documentation. I nodded, signed what they needed, and walked toward Pennsylvania Avenue, where the city traffic sounded like a low, endless heartbeat. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Morales. Hawaii. He sent one sentence. "The cadets are talking about you." I smiled. Words travel faster than storms. That night, I stayed at a hotel near DuPont Circle. The room was simple beige walls, a small desk, a window facing the street. I turned on the news but muted the sound. The caption beneath the anchor's face read, "Former NCIS agent testifies. Senate calls for ethics overhaul." I watched without listening, then switched the screen off. The silence that followed felt earned. I wrote one line in my notebook before turning out the light. Accountability is not revenge. It is repair. Before sleep found me, I thought of Hanlon at Walter Reed, surrounded by doctors who would treat the mind but never the mirror. I did not hate him anymore. Hate is a tether. I had already walked beyond it. Tomorrow the press would find new storms. That was their nature. But tonight the air was still, and for once, silence had a microphone. Would you forgive a man who buried your truth? Comment your answer. 1 year later, the air in Glencoe carried the smell of pine and sun-warmed asphalt, and the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center spread out like a small city of purpose-built halls and patient sidewalks. I arrived before sunrise, unlocked the classroom, and let the quiet hold steady while I wrote the first sentence on the board. Integrity is the quietest kind of courage. The chalk line looked almost fragile until the light from the eastern windows touched it and turned the words solid. By 8, the room filled with cadets in fresh uniforms' faces that had seen little of what policy sounds like when it breaks, but eager to learn how to make it hold. The syllabus read Operational Ethics, but the class was a study in breath under pressure. I told them that procedures are a ladder and a veil at the same time, and that their task is to climb without using the cloth to hide what they see. When I asked for questions, a young woman in the front row raised her hand and asked why we begin with silence. Because silence is where courage notices the shape of fear, I said, and because words are most accurate when they are late rather than eager. The door opened quietly and Lex Morales stepped in with a stack of case packets under his arm. He had requested a transfer months earlier, and the paperwork had traveled the slow roads of bureaucracy until it found his new badge. He nodded to the class, then to me, and took his place by the projector cart like he had always belonged in rooms where light clarified record. The cadets whispered his name in the way students speak of someone who has seen the exam before it is written. We distributed the packets. The case study on the first page did not use the phrase "ghost return," though every page held its gravity. We had removed the names and left the coordinates remove the medals, and left the orders remove the gossip, and left the timestamps. I told them they would present findings as if testifying that they should describe actions, not intentions, that they must never invent motive when the record is enough. One cadet asked if leadership is always a virtue. I said leadership is a voltage that can run a hospital or a fence, and that ethics is the hand on the switch. When the morning break arrived, I walked the hallway and watched sunlight move along the floor like a measured metronome. On my office wall, a single shadow lay across the framed medal I had brought from Tacoma. It was not the kind that draws attention in a parade. It was small and plain and engraved only with a date. Above it hung a photo of the memorial in Coronado, taken after the inscription had been corrected. I kept the images there not as trophies, but as anchors. Justice does not retire, I wrote under the frame on a small card, because reminders work best when they do not ask permission to be seen. After lunch, Lex set up the projector for the afternoon sequence. The module was called Decision in the Blind, a curated series of transmissions that taught recognition of signals rather than admiration of noise. He introduced the exercise without ornament. You will hear a request for abort, he said. You will also hear a voice that sounds certain. Your task is not to praise certainty. Your task is to measure it. The room listened with the posture of people who know the next sentence will change how they hear everything after it. When the audio finished, The cadets debated in pairs, then stood and spoke as if sworn. One said that command without context is a blunt instrument. Another said that fear can masquerade as decisiveness and that the cure is audit, not bravado. A third cadet paused before speaking and then said that silence coerced by rank feels safe until it becomes a wall between the living and the truth. I let the last sentence sit without commentary. Teaching is often the art of staying out of the way when a mind is touching something it will not forget. At the end of class, an older trainee in the back waited until the room was almost empty. He approached slowly, hat in hand, the brim turning between his fingers. "My father served in the Navy," he said. "He loved the water and the quiet. He used to tell me that real courage leaves room for tomorrow. Thank you for saying it out loud in a way I can use." I told him to write the sentence down and carry it in a pocket he does not use for anything else. He smiled and said that pockets like that are rare. He left and the door closed with the soft click of a compass settling north. In the evening, I walked the training grounds and counted the small prayers of routine boots in cadence on the track, the low rumble of a bus, laughter by the vending machines, cold water from a fountain. Healing often sounds like an ordinary day that has finally learned how to stay. When I reached my office again, the sun was lowering behind the pines, and the metal on the wall caught a narrow band of amber light. It made the engraving glow as if the metal had learned to store a sunset. I stood there and let memory do its work. I saw the hall in Coronado and the faces that would not forget the sound of a single sentence. I saw Washington and the microphone that gave silence a place to stand. I saw Tacoma and the match that turned a tape into smoke. Peace is the last clearance I wrote on the small card beneath the frame, and the sentence felt both final and open. Lex knocked once and stepped inside with a final roster for the term. He placed it on the desk and looked at the metal, then at me. "You sure you want it there?" he asked. "Some will guess." "Let them," I said. We turned Ghost Return into a lesson. The lesson is what stays. He nodded, then asked if the cadets had surprised me. "Every day," I said. "They prove that repair is teachable." He laughed quietly. "That is a better headline than anything we got last year." Night settled over the campus. The hallway lights warmed the glass in the office door, and the reflection showed two figures that looked less like survivors and more like instructors who had made peace with gravity. We locked the room and stepped outside. The sky was a deepening blue that held the last note of gold just above the trees, and for a long moment we stood without speaking. Then I said that tomorrow we would run a new exercise about chain of custody and moral weather, and he said he would build a map that makes timestamps feel like coordinates you can walk. We parted at the crosswalk with the ease of people who trust work to hold them in place. Back in the dorm, the radio on my shelf found a jazz station that never learned to shout. I packed the next day's notes and set the alarm for early. Before turning out the light, I wrote one line in my notebook. She turned the file into a lesson. When the room went dark, the metal on the wall kept a memory of the sunset for a breath longer, then surrendered it to the night, and the quiet that followed felt earned and strong. The Smithsonian Rotunda smelled of old stone and polish, a scent that always feels like preservation more than age. The exhibit banner stretched across the entrance in clean Navy letters. Recovered evidence Operation Ghost Return. Beneath it, the display cases glowed under museum light, each object suspended in quiet testimony. The recorder was there melted at its edges, its label still legible enough to read the numbers burned into the plastic. Next to it, a brass plaque read, "Donated by former NCIS agent Avery Locke. Evidence declassified March 2026. Visitors moved slowly, their reflections rippling across the glass. They whispered as people do in sanctuaries. I stood a few steps back, not part of the tour, not a subject either, just someone watching history learn its balance. Ruth arrived first. She wore the calm of someone who had seen too many verdicts to expect neat conclusions. She smiled softly and touched my arm. "You gave them something honest to study," she said. "That's rare here." Lex joined us soon after, his posture straighter, his face marked by a small scar near his temple I had not noticed before. He handed me a program and nodded toward the crowd. "They added your quote to the wall," he said. I looked. Above the display, etched into marble, the words read, "Integrity isn't lost in storms, it's lost in comfort." For a moment, the air thickened with memory. Marcus Delaney appeared next, older, heavier, the kind of weight that comes from outlasting too much. He grinned and said, "You realize this is the first time truth ever made the Smithsonian." I said it probably cost them sleep. He laughed, then went quiet, his eyes fixed on the melted recorder. The ceremony began without much ceremony. A curator spoke briefly about ethics in service and the role of record in accountability. She mentioned my name, my title once, and then let the artifacts speak. That was the correct ratio. I preferred it that way. After the applause faded, a young student lingered near the podium. She was maybe 20, wearing a cadet pin from Quantico. She hesitated, then approached. "Ma'am," she said softly, "may I ask you something?" "Of course." "Did you ever fear losing everything?" Her voice wavered on the word everything. I smiled. I did. And that's when I realized truth was all I had left. She nodded slowly, as if memorizing the rhythm of the sentence rather than the words themselves. She thanked me and left notebook already open in her hand. I watched her disappear into the group and thought about the quiet courage that hides inside first questions. A few minutes later, a young man approached the exhibit guard, spoke briefly, and was allowed through the small barrier rope. He was tall, maybe late 20s, dark hair, eyes too aware for his age. He stopped in front of me, hands in his pockets. He said his name before I could ask. "Nate Hanlon." I said, "I know." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. He looked down at it like it was fragile. "He asked me to give you this." I took it carefully. The paper was thick, the handwriting neat. I did not open it immediately. Nate said he doesn't talk much these days. He stays near the base clinic. But he wanted you to have that. He looked away toward the recorder, the way children look at something that once frightened them, but now feels explainable. "My father said the ghosts can rest now," he whispered. "Thank you." I opened the envelope after he left. Inside was a single folded note. The ink had smudged in one corner. "You taught me what leadership really costs. The ghosts can rest now." I read it twice, then folded it again and slid it back into the envelope. For a long moment, I stood still, listening to the low murmur of the museum. Somewhere, a child laughed somewhere else, a guide whispered about protocol, and above it all, the ceiling light shifted with the clouds outside. I looked up at the final display panel. Operation Ghost Return Integrity Recovered. The words reflected faintly across the glass of the exhibit case, overlapping the melted recorder like a second caption written by time. I whispered to no one in particular, "The storm's over. Let it echo in peace." Ruth heard me and placed her hand lightly on my shoulder. Marcus adjusted his glasses. Lex stood with his arms crossed, expression unreadable, but steady. The curator announced that the museum would be closing soon. Visitors began to drift toward the exits, their footsteps soft on the marble. We stayed a little longer, the four of us, the way soldiers sometimes linger after the flag is folded. When we finally stepped outside, evening had arrived over the mall. The sky was lavender at the horizon, fading into deep blue. The reflecting pool mirrored the monument lights, each ripple carrying fragments of the city's quiet hum. Lex walked ahead to call a cab. Ruth waved to someone across the plaza. Marcus checked his watch and said nothing. I turned back once to look at the museum steps. Through the glass, I could still see the faint gold gleam of the plaque under the lights. Some medals you keep in silence, others in museums. I smiled and began walking. The air was cool, steady, the kind of calm that follows the end of a long investigation. Justice no longer felt like a verdict. It felt like balance. I had spent years chasing ghosts. Tonight they finally landed. Would you expose the truth if it meant losing everything you built?